discussed that there are different decisions that the educator must make in the Montessori classroom. We've talked about how to make those decisions, and we've talked a little bit about which decisions are kind of up for observation and to then make the decision based on what an individual educator observes in his or her classroom and what should be done in a prescribed way. I gave the example that in order for the pink tower to be used appropriately, you must hold, as well as the brown prisms, the cubes of the pink tower or the prisms of the brown stair, must be held like this for the child to both feel the weight and to feel the dimensions and have that information encoded in to the child's brain in the way that benefits him or her the most. So that's one of those things that even if you have a very tiny child using the materials, and to keep them from dropping them all over the place, you maybe give them an option to use a second hand, you would never have that be the way you present it to all the children, because it defeats the purpose of the materials. So how do we make these decisions? How do we decide whether or not something must be done an exact way or try out some different variations in the classroom? One of the things that I'm going to suggest is, as I've also mentioned, the first thing is to understand why do you do it the way that you have been taught, either through Dr. Montessori's books or through the training that you've had. What is the reason for doing things a certain way? If you understand that, it's usually relatively simple to make a decision whether something can be experimented with or whether it's pretty set in stone, if you will. An example of that is interrupting a child who is focusing. We have a fire, we're going to interrupt the child. If something else happens, maybe another child is having an emergency in the classroom and you're concerned that the child would be upset by that, those would be extraordinary circumstances where you would interrupt a working child. But that would be the level of exception that would need to happen for you to violate that principle. I'm going to suggest that as Montessorians, we need to understand those principles so deeply and so implicitly that it becomes very natural to us to have an atmosphere of respect in the classroom and to know from moment to moment what we can experiment with and what we can't. Those of you who are familiar with some of the variations that I endorse in the Montessori classroom know that I feel very comfortable with experimenting with well done, well organized, and materials that are in the spirit of what Dr. Montessori herself created. I'm very comfortable with substituting what I call second generation math materials. However, I don't believe you can do that without having a deep understanding of what the original materials were intended to do. If you have that, then I think you're in a position where you can make those experiments. I do think this is the time, as we have so many Montessori schools opening up across the United States. We have so many Montessorians who have very little experience in the classroom, who don't have a particular preference for one math material or another. This is a perfect time for us to do this kind of experimentation in a formal way, to do research, to have a traditional, have one classroom have a traditional first generation Montessori material in use and have a second very comparable classroom, maybe even in the same school, have a similar second generation Montessori material used, and do some observations, see what happens in these two classrooms with different children within those classes so that we have some data on which is most appropriate. When we have something like that, materials that are both well designed, both have been experimented with over the years and proven to do what they're intended to do, that's a place where we could do some valid and respectful Montessori research. Now, where do we not do that sort of thing? One place that I have seen that I have a little bit of a problem with the approach to training in some circumstances is, if you can give me a reason why you did it your own way, that's fine. No. there are valid reasons and there are invalid reasons. One of the examples that I was given when someone who I think feels similar to the way that I do about this, the example that was given was that someone was demonstrating the metal insets, and rather than taking the materials one at a time to the workspace, they sort of stacked them up on their hand in a way that an adult could do without having a problem, but in a way that would be very inappropriate for a child, almost any child, to attempt, because it was very likely they would dump the materials on the floor, end up handling them roughly, and even just be frustrated by attempting to do what the adult did and not be successful. And I can't even remember what the rationalization that was given when this person was in training and transporting materials that way. I can't remember what they said, but it wasn't valid, because the principle that we are to model correct behavior for the children is such an overreaching principle that we would not want to violate it. And for a training circumstance to support that, I find very problematic. Now, would I say, no, you can't do that, that's bad? Of course not. What I would say is something along the lines of, well, let's think about why we would do it the way it was presented to you and why you would do it the way you just did. What's the benefit and the potential problems of both of them? Most Montessori trainees, if they were to the point where they were showing something like that to another group of trainees, would be at the point to say, well, the child would probably have a hard time doing this. Some variation of that is likely to come out either from the person doing it or those, I hope, respectfully discussing the situation with them. At that point, it's very appropriate to direct that adult and to say, would we ever want to model something that was potentially so, it had so much potential for not being a successful experience for the child? And I think most adults would then come to that decision. So I believe that as we are preparing to be part of the prepared environment, as we're choosing things that are distracting to wear or not distracting to wear, as we're choosing how to walk through the classroom, how to communicate with other adults in the classroom, choosing not to raise our voices or talk across the class unless there is an emergency, these are the kinds of things that need to be kept in mind, is how do we make these decisions so that the bedrock of our classroom is a place that's respectful. Once that's in place, then we have some places where we may make some variations. Now, what I'd like to talk about for the rest of this segment is what I call a transition classroom. So I am going to consider a transition classroom to be a Montessori environment in which the people who have set it up or who are leading the class that is held in that space have a commitment to authentic Montessori education. They have decided this class is going to be run in such a way that all of the benefits of Montessori education are gained. The mixed age classroom, the complete prepared environment, treating the children respectfully, the environment itself is respectful, has furniture that's of the size that the children need. All of those attributes are where we are going with our Montessori classroom. But for one reason or another, we can't be there yet. That's what I consider a transition classroom to be. Now, what are some different reasons this might happen? One is, from my perspective, if the adult leading that classroom has not already led a classroom for 3 years, you're in a transition classroom situation. Just as a child must spend 3 years in a class to explore all the curriculum, to max out the different things that they need from that environment, an adult must lead a class of a particular level. So a classroom designed for 3 to 6-year-old children, or for 6 to 9-year-old children, or 9 to 12-year-old children, they must lead that class for 3 years to themselves be able to really be the part of the prepared environment in the way that they're capable of doing. So if you have an adult that hasn't been in the classroom that long, you're in transition. Now, unfortunately, our demand for Montessori education has already, in the United States in 2015, outstripped the ability for the Montessori community to supply completely trained and experienced teachers. So we do have Montessori schools opening and hiring people who have no Montessori training at all. I'm going to say that's so far from the ideal that it's hard for me to endorse that. I do believe that a lot of times these days we're going to have adults that maybe have a few weeks of training in the summer prior to them leading a class. Again, I don't think that this is ideal, but it's the Montessori world that we live in, and the reason for it is a good one. And the reason for it is a positive, encouraging one, which is that we have more and more families who want this for their children. So we need to embrace that. We need to say, okay, we have these adults that are in this space. What do we do to help them be the most prepared part of that prepared environment that we can manage within the time and the space that we have? What is okay and what's not? And I already gave you my idea to put an adult in a Montessori classroom with no Montessori training at all, not even a week or two, I just don't think is appropriate. There's got to be a way to do it differently than that. If schools are committed to Montessori education, they need to find a way to at least allow that person to observe in Montessori classrooms for a few hours at a minimum, to be able to have walked through in a proxy situation of a training environment, the things that they're likely to deal with, to give them at least a few weeks to think through what a day is going to look like, what a week's going to look like, what a year is going to look like. And then where do we go from there? If someone has 3 weeks or 6 weeks of training, are they ready to plan out their year? I don't think so. I think that they may need more support than someone who has maybe a year of training before they are in a position of leading a classroom. So do we need to provide them more of what most Montessori educators would be able to decide on their own? I think so. And this is the kind of thing where if you're going to have to learn on the job, you're going to need more support than someone who has a full year to internalize the Montessori lessons, and more importantly, the flow and the procedures and the environment of a Montessori prepared classroom. Now, let's talk briefly about the classroom itself. What is essential? I've mentioned in other places that a $25,000 budget is needed to properly outfit a Montessori classroom. There are certainly going to be schools that open that don't have that budget, that don't have the capability to put that much into a classroom before it opens to the students. So what has to be there? First, it's got to be a healthy environment. It's got to have circulation, it's got to have light, it's got to have furniture that suits the children that are in that classroom. Now, that is a very general standard, and it's going to look different in a school that opens in certain parts of Africa than in urban United States, all right? So I'm not going to say you have to have this many square feet per children, you have to have this much light, you have to have this much this or that. I don't think that's appropriate to quantify, because we don't want anyone to not start a Montessori community because of limited resources. But we need to consider how limited can it be and still be Montessori. And I'm going to suggest that if you are very limited, it's not even appropriate to call it a Montessori school. It can be appropriate to call it a transition classroom. And the last concept that I'd like to talk about is the children who will be coming into some of these schools, particularly as the Montessori schools in the United States have been shifting and changing from schools where typically if a child comes into a classroom for 6 to 9-year-olds, there's a very good chance they spend at least a year or two in the children's house, in the classroom for the 3 to 6-year-olds. That's not the case now. We have lots of children coming into Montessori as 9-year-olds, 7-year-olds. Those children need to be welcomed, but we also need to consider, how do we welcome them? one of the principles that's absolutely essential that we keep paramount is respect. If a child is not able to treat the materials in the classroom with respect, but even more so, and I would say as a deal breaker, if there is a child that cannot treat the other children in the classroom with respect with a relatively short period of orientation, we need to consider whether or not that child can stay in that classroom. Not in the classroom, in that classroom. If we're going to have children coming into Montessori at all ages, we have to decide whether or not we need to have classrooms set up where they have to focus on learning to be respectful. The reason for this is the whole basis of Montessori education is highly focused, self-chosen work. If you have 3/4 of a classroom, 9/10 of a classroom of children who are able to do that, able to make a start on that, and able to do that without interfering with anyone else doing that, you must protect those children's opportunities from children who first and foremost need to learn to be respectful. Do we need to welcome all children? We absolutely do. Would we welcome them all into the same classroom at the same time? I think that's something we need to rethink as we're dealing with transition Montessori classrooms. I've been ordering painted lady butterflies from this company for 35 years. In the last few years, they've also added life cycles of the insects that are models that help the children to see the details that are difficult to see in real insects, especially tiny ones such as ladybugs, one of the things I've ordered from them in recent years. It's so amazing for the children to get to see the caterpillars spin their chrysalids and then emerge from them and become the butterflies that they can observe for a few days before we release them out into the wild. I encourage you to look into this as an activity for your own classroom.
Hi, my name is Kayla. I work with a zoo called Wild Wonders. Over there. Wild Wonders is it's a private zoo, but we focus on providing educational programs for different schools, different library programs. We're home to over 150 animals that some our owner relinquished, some their owners couldn't take care of anymore. Some of them are rescued. Wildlife, other types of animals. This is Maisie that I have with me today. Maisie is an albino Colombian boa constrictor. And since she's an albino, they're typically found in the rainforest, but she would probably stick out like a sore thumb. She wouldn't blend in with all those leaves that she has in her natural environment. And so we provide a home for animals just like Maisie. We have lots of small animals there, and we like to provide interactive programs. So when we go to a school or do a library program, we usually bring 6 animals and come on in, and the kids get to touch them. We work very hard at handling our animals so that they can be interactive, and so there's a chance you can touch a snake. Ashley, right on over here, has Misto. Misto is an African pygmy hedgehog, and today we just have a small cross-section of some of the animals that call our zoo home that we take care of and that we want to bring out and share with your school. Hopefully soon.